Is it theatre?
Is it all theatre? I don't think it is. I mean, I think that it's, well, okay, to start off with, it's extremely difficult to interpret Trump. What he's doing, what he's trying to achieve. I think that one of the really relevant questions that is not clear, even though people haste to make up their mind, it's not at all clear whether Trump and his team have a well thought out plan, or whether they're just swinging left and right and making it up as they go along. And that's a very relevant question, because if they have a thought out plan, then you can try to guess what the plan is and how they might be achieving it, how they might be moving ahead towards that plan, what the obstacles are, and so forth. Then the analysis is maybe a bit easier. If they're making things up as they go along, then it's impossible. It's just a blizzard of nonsense coming at us from all sides all the time. Well, we also have to understand that Trump has very, very powerful enemies, because he really is upending a system that's been it's been created and reinforced as a way of protecting the privileges of a certain privileged class in our societies. And they are very upset with Trump, and they are the people who control the media, among other things. And so what comes through from the media is reinforcing the impression that this is just a circus and that Trump is making things up as he's going along. He's no plan. There's nothing other than chaos. And so we need to stop Trump and stop the chaos and get the world back into a rules-based order. I'm not entirely sure, but here's, over the past 3 months, having spoken about this to a good many people, and some of them claim that they have first-hand knowledge from people who are close to the Trump administration and who are sometimes sitting in cabinet meetings. The feedback is that Trump is not a deep thinker, okay? Which doesn't exclude the possibility that he has a certain intuitive acumen, which is positive and accurate, that he knows what he wants to do and he understands how to do it in a certain street smart way. But I also have pretty good feedback about, from a Bosnian politician who said that he went to a meeting in Washington, not with Trump and his people, but a level down in the hierarchy in the State Department. And he said, I went there prepared to explain to them who we are and where Bosnia is on the map. And he said, I was shocked to find that they were very, very well informed, very knowledgeable, that they understood the situation in detail and nuance. And so what that tells me is that maybe the top level leadership, they are as they are, cowboys may be shooting off the hip and they know what they want to do, but maybe the plan is vague, but that the people in the deeper in the hierarchy of the command and control structure are actually learned, sophisticated thinkers who are doing their jobs properly. And there's always a two-way communication going on. So if the commander-in-chief says, "Hey, let's do this," people down in the hierarchy will say, "Sir, this is not a good idea." And as we've learned from many of these military men, it's in the end it's the colonels who who decide what is done and what is not done, because sometimes general who are politically appointed people aren't as competent as they are, and they're all ultimately afraid of blundering, so they don't, they might not insist if a qualified person tells them don't do this. Okay, so having said all that, let's pretend for a minute that they have a plan and that they are trying to advance that plan. What might that be? I think that we can start with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." How would you do that? It would appear from what we see and hear, it would appear that just going around shaking people down, telling them, you do what we say or we're going to hurt you, and everybody sees that. But I think that if we take a very high level view and we take it in the historical perspective, I think that what Trump and this is where the tariffs work into the equation, I think that what Trump and his team are trying to achieve is to return the United States from the British system of free trade to the American system of productive economy. Okay? And so what is the difference? The difference is that the British system of free trade tends to create these boom-bust cycles that the banking interests in the economy consistently and repeatedly inflate asset bubbles and then pull the rug from under them. Because that's the process of creating private money in the form of credit and then forcing it into the economic system inflates asset bubbles, whether it's housing, equities, bonds, whatever. They play this game as insiders, so they know what they're going to do, right? They know they're going to prime up the housing sector, for example, and then they know how to position themselves in advance. And then the credit impulse goes, and then people start buying houses, bidding up real estate prices, and that way they inflate a bubble, as they've done in the early 2000s. And then at a certain moment, they yank the credit, the bubble implodes, but they bail out before that. And we've seen that so many times, and it appears to be unrelated because there was a bubble in Japan in the 1980s. There was a housing bubble. There was a Nasdaq.com bubble. Now we have an everything bubble. Well, okay, so bonds have started deflating properly, but until 2-3 years ago, everything was at 200-year highs, right? And then in the process, they plunder a great deal of wealth from out of the society, and then they even through their political influence they get bailouts. So when the housing bubble imploded in 2008, the bankers got at least $16 trillion in bailouts, the too big to fail banks, and not just American ones. And that's official, that's according to the Government Accountability Office. Higher independent estimates go to as high as $29 trillion. And I, as a lifelong market professional, I think that whatever the government concedes, double it at least. So I think that we're talking something in the neighborhood of $29 trillion. And that is more than $85,000 per man, woman, and child living in the United States. That's an absolutely massive loot. And this same mechanism is being perpetuated everywhere all the time. It's the system of colonial loot, and so it leaves a country crippled. It leaves a country impoverished and destroyed, as we can see in the United States today. A couple of these bubbles burst, booms and busts, and the United States has been terribly weakened. The U.S. cities are full of homeless people, drug addicts. And the infrastructure is falling apart. It's been deindustrialized largely. So I think that making America great again probably is an effort to reverse all this. And how do you reverse all this? You have to allocate credit not to financial speculation, but to the production of physical goods. And so you have to repair the infrastructure, you have to repair the energy systems, ports, shipbuilding, communications. There's a lot of work. And you also have to disenfranchise the people who suck the wealth from out of the society through these financial manipulations and speculation. And these are very powerful and wealthy people. So, Trump cannot come out in the open and say, hey, this is what we're going to do. Because even though most people, the ordinary people, entrepreneurs, employee people, everybody in the economy would say, that's great, at last. There will be a lot of these very, very powerful people who would want him dead. All 8 US presidents who have either been assassinated while in office or died suddenly and mysteriously, all 8 of them have been trying to promote the American system of political economy, what I'm talking about. And this system goes back to the 1800s. Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, Henry Carey, formulated this in his book called Harmony of Interests. And so the powers that be don't want this. They want pump and dump schemes forever because it's a big wealth extraction conveyor belt that they control. And if Trump is going to make America great again, then this would be a way to do it. But then you also have to avoid getting killed. And in Trump's case, today, it's enough that he's constantly barraged in the media for this or that people lose confidence, that people think like, well, this is a circus. This is, we're being led by clowns. They have no idea what they're doing. And so the headwinds are going to be very strong and very powerful. And I think that this is what we're seeing now. And whether Trump is going to be successful or not, that's the thing that we can't know now. We will have to wait and see how it goes. In the meantime, I would just, for your viewers and listeners, I would suggest that we have to be a little bit circumspect about the way we judge Trump and his administration, because we don't know exactly what they're doing. And a lot of it, because if what I'm saying, if there's some substance to what I'm saying, then 100% they have to do it either covertly, they have to hide their hand, or they have to move in such an unpredictable fashion that they disorient their opposition, they confuse the opposition. And so we have to kind of accept that uncertainty is going to run high for a while. But if you blast them and criticize them for everything, then you're actually reducing the likelihood that they will be successful. So you're actually helping the other side, which has been ripping off and humiliating humanity collectively for I would say at least 2 centuries now.
But Alex, I saw a video, I think from 2012, of Trump giving a talk, and already there he was presenting a fairly anti-China stance, which indicates to me that he has a personal gripe with China, unless I'm misinterpreting. And then what about in 2024? I think one of his key advisors wrote that document about how to readjust the global system, which seems to be playing out right now. Stephen Moran, I think his name is. Stephen Moran, is that right?
Yeah. Well, I read Steve Moran's paper. I can say that I can say I'm impressed that he's a very thoughtful man. I'm not necessarily impressed with the contents of the paper, but at the same time, the paper that's available out there, I think, and my understanding is that it's not the finished version. So, whatever. But, it's better than nothing. It means they think things through. They have a strategy. If you have a strategy, you have something to work on. Strategies are never etched in stone documents. You always have to adjust it with time because things never play out the way you plan them to be. Okay, fair enough. The hostility towards China, I'm not sure about that either, because I know from Trump's mouth himself that he speaks to Xi Jinping on the regular, because he not only conceded that he spoke with Xi Jinping, but he also kind of, in one of those press conferences, I don't know, like 5-6 weeks ago, he said under his breath, I speak with him a lot. So there's a certain level of coordination between Trump and his people and the Russians and the Chinese. The rise of China has actually been achieved by applying this Hamiltonian American system of political economy, right? And the Russians are following the same model in their own way. And so it seems to me that there's a certain level of coordination which obviously, again, cannot be fully disclosed. And it seems to me that this hostility stance is more for show. And I'll give you a concrete example. One of the big problems in the United States is the fentanyl crisis, the crisis of overdose deaths. And these drugs are flowing into the United States on an industrial scale. And if you read the media, it's all China, China, China. And Trump is not making much effort to distance himself from this narrative. It's China, China, China. And so it would seem, like if you take your impressions from the general narrative, you would get the impression that the Chinese are deliberately smuggling drugs into the United States to get the Americans drugged up, I guess. But, opium wars have been a tool and a weapon of foreign policy used by the British Empire for over 200 years. So that's, that would be, if I were investigating this problem, that would be top on my list of suspects. And then B, the whole drug cartel network couldn't possibly exist without the support and the service of money laundering banks, because they generate something like $400 million of revenues per week in the United States, and it's virtually all cash. So Mexican drug cartels earn billions upon billions of dollars in cash. They have these pallets of cash that they have to bring into Mexico. A large part of it goes back to Mexico. What do you do with that money? What do you do with that cash? You see, if you take that money in cash, well, now you have to store it somewhere, and you have to pay guards to guard it. And you can't spend it on just anything. You know, what could you buy if you only had cash at your disposal? You could buy, I don't know, some cars, some houses, you could pay for some prostitutes, you could buy some champagne and caviar, but you know, after a while, there's not much more you can do with that, because cash, there are certain limitations to cash transactions. As we know from investigative reports by the Pentagon, by U.S. Government, Mexican drug cartels have heavy weaponry. They have whole militaries fielded. They have submarines. They have helicopters. They have anti-tank weapons. They have all kinds of stuff that they could never buy with pallets of cash. Another problem is that if you have cash, you have to pay men to guard it. And what can happen is that these men could say to themselves, hey, why should we guard this money for El Chapo Guzman? We have weapons here. We're armed. We're capable. Let's just take this money for ourselves. Start our own cartel. So you have a certain weakness. You have a certain vulnerability, because these piles of cash would be a magnet for alternative, rival gangs, for police and law enforcement, for all kinds of, problems that this cash would attract. Whereas, if you can deposit this money in a bank account, so you have a clean bank account, well then, that bank account will have a signatory or a few signatories. So El Chapo Guzman will have exclusive right to use that money, or his accountant, whoever. And then he decides who gets the money, who doesn't get the money, what gets bought, what doesn't get bought. And the bank is guarding the money for him, no longer armed men. Well, what that means is that the bank is actually, whether wittingly or not, enforcing the cartel's hierarchy. Because they say, we only recognize El Chapo Guzman as the rightful owner of this account, and we only take orders from him. So if he orders a payment or a transfer, we do it. If some guy from the cartel does it, we don't. And so they actually anoint the head of the cartel, and by virtue of giving him exclusive access to this money, which is now being cleaned up by the bank, they make that. This is a long explanation, but I'll get to your question. So it's actually pretty much the bank that is the ultimate godfather of those of those drug cartels. Otherwise, if the cash was on a pile in a storage house, these cartels would splinter into a million rival groups almost instantly and largely eliminate themselves. And then they would be relatively easy target for law enforcement to mop up. As it is, that's nearly impossible. It's, you can get El Chapo Guzman, somebody will take his place. It doesn't matter. And that somebody will always have signature rights at the bank. Okay, so why am I saying all this? Because I've been trying to write about this. I've been trying to kind of alert people, look, it's not China, it's not Mexico, it's the banks. It's the banks always. You cut the money laundering and you've splintered the cartels. That's how you destroy it. So at the top of the heap in Washington, you hear China, China, China. That's the refrain that doesn't go away. I mean, it goes away sometimes with Russia, 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 but then Iran, Iran, Iran. But it's always like that. It's always some obvious target that people can all identify. Because if you say banks, 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 people think like, should I hate my bank teller there? So it's like that. But then a few weeks ago, I watched an interview, and unfortunately I forget the man's name, I forget his office, and I forget what network it was on. But he was, yeah, sorry, but he was one of the people, I think, in the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, or one of those tobacco firearms one of those things in the administration, and he was investigating the fentanyl crisis. And this was people will be able to find this because there was a major bust of a very large fentanyl lab in Canada, and as it turns out, this is the biggest fentanyl lab they ever busted. They ever knew that such a thing could exist. And then it turned out, we don't know, there may be more fentanyl labs because a lot of these drugs come from out of Canada. You know, the same place where the Prime Minister swears an oath of allegiance to the King in London, that place. And then as he was answering questions of the interviewer, and this is like I think it was on a mainstream media network, he started getting into the role of the banks. And so it was clear to me that people in the guts of the administration get it. They understand what they're up against. Yeah. So again, you know, the whole big explanation was to maybe clarify the difference between the facade, where you have somebody at the top going China, 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 because that kind of gets media all excited and it gets everybody's hair on fire, whereas people who are actually tasked with fixing problems have a much, much better understanding of what they're up against and are probably formulating ways to deal with those problems.
So all wars are bankers' wars.
It turns out that's pretty much the way it is. That's
including tariff wars.
Oh, well, you know, the tariff war is, that's not a banker's war. That war is, that war could be said to be the people's war, maybe, you know. We don't know.
Would you mind expanding that a little bit? Because, okay, so hang on, just for clarity, because there's a lot of confusion around the pros and cons of tariffs. Would you mind just making that simple?
Okay, so the obvious part, which is ostensibly the administration's intention, is to penalize imports and to attract manufacturing back home to get the United States back on this American system of political economy. You know, we produce goods and services and we trade those goods and services, and that slowly raises our prosperity back and makes America great again. But at the same time, you know, you're gonna trigger an inflation effect, because as soon as you start imposing tariffs on foreign goods, the price of those goods is going to go up. And not only that, but even domestic producers of those goods are going to raise their prices because now they can. You know, if you make European cars 25% more expensive, the next day, the American car manufacturers are going to be raising their prices because there's now this gap. They're so much more competitive, but they also want to make money. So, and you get inflation effect from that. That's unavoidable. There's another very, very important inflation effect with tariffs is that, you know, the way the system has been set up is that you have this non-stop, and this is part of the, you know, blowing of financialized bubble and creating this boom and bust sequence, is that the monetary mass in the United States has grown much faster than the GDP. And you know, once upon a time, when people talked about inflation, when economists talked about inflation, they were not talking about the price rise. They were talking about the growth of the money mass, growth of the amount of money in circulation in an economy. And so we've had this monetary inflation for decades, and it's grown faster than the GDP, but it hasn't produced consumer price inflation. And part of the reason, there are two major pressure release valves in the economic system that keep the monetary inflation from creating consumer price inflation. One of them is the stock markets, the equity let's call it asset markets. So the money that goes into stocks and bonds doesn't circulate in the bricks and mortar economy, so it doesn't exert pressure on consumer prices. That's one big pressure release valve. The other one is foreign trade, because you're importing goods from abroad. These goods keep the price pressures at home down, and the money that you spend on this good goes into the goes into the accounts of exporting nations with the Fed. So that money doesn't circulate in your domestic economy either, and thereby it doesn't pressure the consumer prices. So what we've had in the United States since the 1980s, you had the trade gap, the trade deficits going up and up and up and up. And I think that by February, by the time Trump came to office, they reached $130 billion. It was just going bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I think that even last 2 months of Biden administration, the Autopen administration, they went from about $78 billion in trade deficits in November of 24 to 130 billion in January, which is completely unprecedented. It's a massive spike. It almost feels like somebody did this on purpose to rig the British economy. To rig the American economy for demolition so that it could blow up on Trump's watch. But let's say that this trade deficit reflects this draining of the money inflation from U.S. consumer markets, so that you don't have consumer price inflation. Now, when you start to close that gap, when you start imposing tariffs and you start reducing this foreign trade in favor of domestic producers, well, that's another force that's going to exacerbate consumer price inflation. So they're going to get that effect. But again, to be fair, we have to recognize that Trump didn't create this. All these imbalances have been gathering for several decades, since the early 1980s, and this was patently unsustainable. So, when something's unsustainable, it means it's going to blow up at some point. And so, if Trump did nothing, this would all blow up anyway. So it seems to me that what Trump is doing is maybe start to drain the water from behind the dam to reduce the impact from it just bursting uncontrollably. Again, it's risky, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. But he started the process, but he didn't create the imbalances that made the process necessary.
Unless it's just part of the media narrative, it appears that Xi Jinping is giving him the finger.
It does appear so, but again, the tariffs are the wrecking ball Trump is using to raise this free trade system to the ground. And I think that the Chinese would prefer the United States to be on the American system, because the Chinese strategy, the Chinese have positioned themselves as the global manufacturing hub.
They use the term mercantile.
Well, yes, but they want affluent consumers everywhere in the world that can buy their stuff. So they don't want people everywhere to be poor with no purchasing power. So for China, let's say a prosperous United States would be preferable than a desperate United States that's then a security concern. So I think that with the longer view, the Chinese might prefer the United States to move away from free trade, or let's say some kind of a controlled free trade on a bilateral basis, away from this globalist WTO open free trade, where the United States has pretty much become a buyer of last resort, consuming crap from all over the place on credit. So they consume, and their debts are just exploding. It's all on debt. It's a system that's going to implode anyway at some point. You can't run credit card tab forever and keep buying junk from everywhere. And so this system has to be, the change of course was overdue, and it was going to be forced by the markets on the United States in one way or another. And, Sergei Karaganov, several months ago, before Trump was inaugurated, he said that we see our role as helping the United States transition from being an empire to just being a major power in the least disruptive way possible. And I think that the Chinese see it the same way. And so I think between Trump and Xi Jinping, there might be a disoriented war of words, but also a certain level of coordination and cooperation.
So Alex, are you suggesting that Trump is in favor of multipolarity?
Oh, yes. Oh, that's 100%, because go back to 15 January of this year, when Marco Rubio was going through his confirmation hearing. He explicitly said we have to recognize the world is shifting to a multipolar architecture. And he also said that we see the post-World War II global order as more than obsolete, his words, and it's actually being used as a weapon against us, his words. And so Marco Rubio didn't come up with that himself. Marco Rubio was stating the policy position of this administration. And that was an extremely important revelation there. Obviously, the media kind of glossed over it because they would prefer we don't think about it too much. But yes, I think that they are definitely shifting in favor of multipolarity.
So if they're shifting in favor of multipolarity, what does that mean for the US dollar internationally?
I think that the US dollar is going to yield its role as a global reserve currency and global trade settlement currency to something else, which I think will partly... You see, the architecture that it seems to me that the Chinese and the Russians are favoring is some kind of a future currency that's going to be backed by not only gold but other commodities. And then it's going to be a basket in which many countries will participate in proportion of their contribution to that basket of commodities. So the United States is a great producer of commodities. It's a very resource-rich nation, so it will have a major role in that system. This kind of thing has been formulated in a number of papers. I read a few published by Russian think tanks, academics, people who are working on this problem matter. And I think that this too is part of Trump's plan, because one of the big vulnerabilities for the United States is that there's about an estimated 32 or 34, I forget exactly, trillion dollars worth of US dollar denominated assets sitting owned by foreign interests. And this is a real source of vulnerability, because at a given moment, if they all decide to dump their US dollar assets, that could be a tsunami that hits the US economy and their stock markets and the dollar. And so part of the game with the tariff wars is also going to deflate that dam, drain some water from behind that dam to reduce that pressure. And then I think, there's been talk about maybe setting up a dual currency system in the United States, where you have a foreign dollar and a domestic dollar. So, the domestic dollar is used by, people to transact their business at home, and the foreign dollar is used for foreign trade. And this is the model that the Chinese have. And this model has insulated China from external shocks. And, in the last 40 years, China hasn't really, they had financial crisis, in the sense that, they have this real estate, they had this residential real estate bubble that burst. But if you remember in 1997, when there was a massive East Asian financial crisis that pretty much engulfed all the East Asian tiger economies, China went unscathed. And this is exactly why, because they have this dual currency, their domestic economy was not impacted. And so I think that it makes sense that the United States should maybe follow the same model, again, to insulate themselves from external shock, to which they're very vulnerable. So that might be, I don't know, maybe I'm giving the administration too much credit. Maybe I overestimate them. But knowing the nature of the game, I know that if they were thinking along these lines, they would not be able to say it out loud explicitly. They would have to work on this covertly. So we're obliged to guess anyway. So, I'll take the luxury of, I'll take the freedom of guessing wrong. But if you guess otherwise, it's still a guess. You don't know.
Okay, so ultimately, a friendship between America and China is the best outcome. That's the win-win. There's no point in them competing. So what they have to do, therefore, is push ahead with the multipolarity. Is that correct?
I think that's absolutely clear. And, they need to... There's going to be competition, obviously. There's going to be some rivalry in some sectors, but there's also a great deal of complementarity. Is that a word?
It is now.
Yeah, so I officially inaugurate that word. They're complement. There's, I'm really confused. There are areas where their economies could be complementary.
Complementary.
Complementary. Yeah, I don't know if complementarity is quite it. That really tilted my brain. So they can cultivate that. They can develop that. They can trade with one another. There would be a lot of stuff that the Chinese would want to import from the United States. There's a lot of things that the Americans would like to import from China. There's a lot of things that they could develop together to trade with other parts of the rest of the world. So, there's no reason to always default to hostility and, if you are competing us, we just have to take the Tonya Harding approach to competition and kneecap you and wage war. That's that's the dumbest approach to things. And I hope that cannot happen overnight. There's certain modalities of behavior have become hardwired. There's people who have adopted a certain school of thought, certain approach to thinking, and have been, in the guts of the system for decades. They're not going to change overnight. But if you're talking to the people, and so if Trump and his people are talking to the Russians, they're talking to the Chinese, little by little, they can cooperate, they can coordinate, they can define areas of cooperation, they can forge bilateral agreements that are going to work for both sides, and then gradually build on that. And then, it obviously has to include cultural exchange, so that you preempt the xenophobia, the mutual fear of the two sides. And then, you can move the world towards peaceful cooperation and prosperity. It's not a fantasy. If you read Henry Carey's Harmony of Interest, that's practically exactly what he says. The American system is moving the world towards permanent peace and prosperity, whereas the British system of free trade practically requires a state of permanent warfare.
That's so interesting, because that goes against the free market arguments from people like Rothbard and Mises and Hayek, etc.
Yeah, it certainly does, and I know that there are many people there who are very committed to the ideas of the Austrian School of Economics. I was one of them, but I've grown convinced that actually Austrian School of Economics is controlled opposition, because there are too many very obvious flaws in their theory. I'll give you an example. It's practically taken as axiomatic that everything privately owned and privately managed is far superior to anything state-owned and state-managed. Well, if you look around, it's very obvious that this is simply not true. I'll give you a simple example. Because I grew up in former Yugoslavia, and I grew up in Croatia, which was one of the 6 republics comprising former Yugoslavia. It was a socialist country, so I saw the transition from the socialist economy to the capitalist economy. We went along with everything. We just basically took Western legal code and copy-pasted it into our own legal code. Everything became privatized, and so many of these things like water utilities, trash collection, it all went to private owners, and it all postal service, it all deteriorated so radically that it's glaringly obvious to everyone. Our cities used to be very clean, and the technology of taking people's trash and removing it was something that we took for granted. As far as I'm concerned, it was just magic. But you put your trash in the dumpster and it went away, and that was it, and the city was clean. Well, now it's privatized and trash is everywhere. The cities are no longer clean. It stinks because, in order to boost their profits, they reduced the number of runs they do. So it went from trash being collected every day, which is what you want to do if you want to keep your cities clean. They do it once a week. Instead of picking it up in many spots, they've reduced the number of spots. So they actually kind of dumped the work of taking trash on people. So now instead of dumping your trash 10 meters from your house, you have to walk 200 meters with your trash so that they can collect it in fewer locations. It makes sense from their point of view. They want to make profits, but it doesn't make sense from society. And then because they collect the trash only once a week, what happens is that this trash kind of rots there. And in the summer, it's a serious problem because every 200 meters as you walk around the city, and this includes tourist resorts, it smells that there's a rotting corpse somewhere. Well, this begins to become a problem because it attracts rats, and so you're creating the risk of very high external costs, because at some point, with all these rats and cats and stray dogs and fleas and other and maggots and flies, you're actually creating conditions for the outbreak of things that we thought we overcame, like Black Plague, like you can create serious problems just so that the trash corporations could be profitable and maximize their profit so that their share price could go up sky high. Versus when this was state-owned and state-managed, the cities were clean, none of these problems. Same thing with water. We took clean water out of the faucet for granted. Well, now every so often they tell us, oh, you have to boil water. In many cities, the water looks like the water in the United States. Rather than being clean, it's kind of brownish, yellowish, and cloudy. And people are reporting health problems. This is all private enterprise that has degraded the system. Our post office under socialism used to be like Federal Express on its best day, only super cheap. Now it's a disaster. Sometimes parcels come empty. Somebody opens them, takes the stuff. A letter from major cities travel 3 weeks, whereas they used to travel less than a day under socialism, and on and on and on and on.
What is the ultimate win-win? No tariffs anywhere, or tariffs in various guises?
I would say probably tariffs in various guises, because you do want international trade. You don't want a patchwork of autarkies around the world like North Korea that, everybody has to be completely self-sufficient in everything. There's always going to be some things that the Americans are going to be making that's better than anywhere in the world. And there's always going to be things that the French are going to make that's going to be, and we're going to want those things. One of the things on my Christmas list would be to own a Steinway piano, which are made in New York, and they are, they're just like one of those things, like the Rolls Royce of pianos.
Or Fender.
This is very
Fender
difficult.
Or Fender Stratocasters for guitars.
Exactly. Britain makes the world's best hi-fi systems, amplifiers and things like this. And so you're always want to, because it's not just the ability to put together big machines that produce these things. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, a lot of like artisanal know-how that goes into producing these top level things. And that's true everywhere, French wines, Italian garments, clothes and jewelry, shoes, apparel. Every country has certain things that they're really good at, because not only do they make them, they cultivate generational know-how that, advances and refines itself, and then it turns into something that you would prefer to have than over some kind of a forced domestic produced alternative to it. So I think that we're going to always have global trade, but you're going to also want to protect domestic producers of other things. You don't want to just allow the place to be flooded every so often and everything raised to the ground.
But isn't let me use that free market argument. Isn't choice the ultimate freedom?
Yes, I think that statement is true.
Let me rephrase that. You say the market gets flooded with, let's pretend, Chinese crap, but people are choosing to buy that.
Yes and no, because it would be like saying people are choosing to buy cheap food, so everybody buys cheap food. It's they're choosing it because it's cheap, and they're also choosing it because they can't afford more expensive stuff. If people could buy expensive seafood, food and champagne every day and have it on their table, I think that they would choose that. And the fact that they buy, large bottles of Coca-Cola and cheap bread with white flour, it's because they can't do better. And I think that it's, as you raise a community's prosperity and standards of living, they're going to make different choices. And I think that we all prefer quality products over cheap crap. And I think that if we could afford quality products, everybody would have a Steinway piano and a Fender Stratocaster instead of some cheap Chinese alternative to it.
I just want to say that I have a Fender Stratocaster from the United States.
There you go. Yeah.
Is the tariff war that we're currently seeing an attempt to bring sovereignty to America?
Yeah, I think so. But again, we'll see where it goes. You see, I have a hard time with the idea that Trump and his cabinet are just clowns careening from one crisis to the next without a plan. Because if that were the case, they would never have even started the tariff war. If they did this, they did it for some reason. So you're forced to try to understand what could be the reason. What's worth the attacks and political pressures that they must have known this would draw on them? And I think that the Make America Great Again slogan is probably more important than just a bumper sticker slogan for election purposes. I think maybe that's as important to them as Build Back Better is to the Davos set. There's like a whole agenda, an intended agenda. It's something that you intend to accomplish. So you're not just shooting off the hip randomly. You're actually trying to take the system somewhere. And so even if very serious mistakes are made, even if the strategy ultimately fails, because it could, it's very hard for me to reconcile this with the idea that, they're just a big bunch of clowns who have no idea what the hell they're doing.
And by extension, is this a good thing for BRICS?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, because you see, my conviction is that the most important struggle in the world today is the struggle for the United States. Because if the United States aligns with the multipolar world and becomes a part of it, a major part of it, but a part of it. I think it was Larry Johnson in one of our conversations who said that the choice before the United States now is either to be the world's policeman or to be the polite guest at the global banquet. And so that is really the choice. Are you going to join the multipolar integrations and be part of it? Or are you going to force your order on everybody else at the with a gun to everybody's head? And so for the multipolar integrations, having the United States become part of them and become that polite guest at the table is a huge win, because it also takes the United States away from the globalist forces that want the United States to be their enforcement arm with 1,000 military bases everywhere around the world, telling everybody, you do as we say or we're going to hurt you, sending these carrier strike groups and bombing the crap out of everybody. It will be a much, much better world. And we see how desperate the other side is to keep the United States on their side at the moment, concretely, to be the guarantor of security for the Ukraine's government, which is, the idea is that the United States does all the heavy lifting and all the dirty work, while the European banking families continue to enjoy their privileges.
But then this also, by extension, means that the US would become less favorable to NATO.
Yes, absolutely. That's a given. NATO is the creation of this globalist set. Its whole history is very, very suspect. We didn't know these things, but we know that NATO was created, I think, in 1948 or 1949, right out of practically, the smoke from World War II was still smoldering when Winston Churchill declared the Soviet Union the enemy of the West. That was in 1946. It was his Fulton speech in front of Harry Truman. And ever since, the West has been moving pieces into place to create this Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. And, the NATO has just kind of grown by accretion around that. And the United States has always been the main military, political, diplomatic, and financial muscle behind that. So if the United States withdraws from Europe, that whole thing, collapses into nothing. Look, I could turn out to be wrong, but, everybody who is opining on this is guessing.
Yes.
And we don't exactly know. I heard the other day somebody whose opinion I really respect opine on this very negatively. And they were saying that, this is putting the independence of central bank in jeopardy. And I'm thinking, how is that a bad thing? Excuse me. Why is the independence of central bank all of a sudden this sacred cow that we shouldn't question? You see, that's what I was referring to. There's been a certain school of thought has become entrenched in our society to the extent that many people now, almost by knee-jerk reaction, default to the opinions they formed a long time ago, and until they question them, they will often default also to the wrong conclusion and then invalid analysis. And I grew up in communism, so I became very comfortable early on in my life with questioning absolutely everything, because up until I was 17, 18 years of age, I was taught about communism, about Marxism, the greatest thing ever since sliced bread, right? And then it turns out the whole thing was a lie. The whole thing was kind of contrived in order to uphold the communist ideology. But every part of it was flawed or outright false. And so I take the same approach with Western ideology, with Austrian School of Economics, with Milton Friedman's economics, with Keynesian. I mean, with the whole political, everything. I don't take anything for granted. And so I try to avoid to default to these opinions that stem from assumptions that maybe themselves are not valid. But that doesn't mean that I'm right. I could turn out to be wrong as well.
How can I follow your work?
There are many ways, but 3 platforms where I'm the most active is on X. My handle is @nakedhedgy. I have a personal publication on Substack called Alex Krainer's Trend Compass. Alex Krainer's Substack. And then I have a daily newsletter for investors and traders called iSystem Trend Compass. So that's 3 places where I'm most active. Then there's a company website and blah blah blah. But these 3 are the easiest places to find me.
Well, on that note, excuse me, let me try that again. On that note, Alex Krainer, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Jeremy, great pleasure. Thank you for having me, and warm greetings to your viewers and listeners.